What happens when the most powerful nation on Earth can't get its own allies to back a massive defense deal? That's the question now swirling in Washington and Ottawa after Donald Trump shocked military leaders by demanding a $20 billion submarine contract be secured immediately, only for Canada to push back harder than anyone expected. This isn't just about ships under the ocean. This is about trust, strategy, and the very future of North American security. Imagine the United States, the world's top military spender, suddenly hitting a wall because its closest neighbor won't play along. Canada has made it clear they're not signing a blank check for Trump's vision of American-led defense, and the fallout is already rattling defense analysts, NATO planners, and global rivals who are quietly taking notes. Could this be the moment when U.S. defense dominance begins to unravel, not because of China or Russia, but because of cracks forming right at home in North America? Stay tuned, because this story goes much deeper than submarines. For decades, the United States has relied on its ability to project power anywhere in the world, whether through aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, or nuclear submarines. These undersea giants aren't just machines, they're symbols of deterrence. Silent. Hunters that protect coastlines, patrol trade routes, and keep rivals guessing. That's why Trump's sudden push for a $20 billion submarine contract immediately raised eyebrows. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward defense move: invest more in submarines to stay ahead of China and Russia. But behind the scenes, this decision has sparked a storm. The real drama began when Canada, America's closest ally, economic partner, and NORAD defense collaborator, rejected Trump's push. Ottawa's reasoning? The deal wasn't in Canada's national interest, came with unclear costs, and looked more like a political power play than a strategic necessity. In blunt terms, Canada slammed the door, signaling that it won't bankroll American defense ambitions at any price. This matters, right now, because the U.S. military is facing pressure from all sides. Rising costs, recruitment challenges, and technological competition with China mean Washington needs allies more than ever. But if those allies start questioning U.S. leadership, especially a country as close as Canada, that sends a dangerous signal across the world. Add Trump's unpredictable style to the mix, and suddenly what should have been a routine defense contract is turning into a geopolitical earthquake. So why does this matter? Because this clash isn't just about money or submarines. It's about the future of U.S.-Canada relations, the stability of NATO, and whether America can still convince its friends that its defense strategies are worth the price tag. Number 1. Trump's gamble. When Donald Trump made his push for a $20 billion submarine expansion, it wasn't just another defense policy proposal. It was pure Trump politics, wrapped in national security language. Throughout his political career, Trump has positioned himself as a master negotiator, someone who can twist arms, cut deals, and make allies fall in line. This demand for more submarines was pitched as a straightforward necessity. America needs to stay ahead of China and Russia beneath the seas, so therefore allies should contribute and get on board. But the way Trump presented it felt less like a collaborative defense plan and more like a business ultimatum. For decades, U.S. presidents have relied on quiet diplomacy to bring allies along. Trump, however, tends to use public pressure, dramatic statements, and sheer force of personality. He treated this submarine push as though it were a real estate deal, something you demand and expect others to buy into because walking away looks weak. His message to allies like Canada was simple: America is leading, and if you want the benefits of U.S. protection, you need to share the costs. But here's where the gamble comes in. Trump assumed that Canada, with its deep economic and defense ties to the U.S., would simply sign off. He thought Ottawa would calculate that refusing Washington carried more risks than rewards. Yet that calculation turned out to be wrong. Canada didn't just hesitate, it outright rejected the push. This wasn't the scripted outcome Trump expected, and it revealed a major weakness in his approach. By making the deal public and high stakes, Trump raised the political cost of rejection. When Canada said no, it wasn't just about submarines. It became a symbolic defiance of Trump's entire strategy. Instead of proving his deal-making skills on the international stage, Trump showcased the limits of his pressure tactics. The more he framed the contract as a do-or-die issue, the more Canada's refusal looked like a direct blow to his credibility. Critics argue that Trump's gamble reflects a deeper flaw in his foreign policy style. He often mistakes personal leverage for national influence. In business, you can pressure partners into submission. In geopolitics, allies have their own interests, their own domestic politics, and their own red lines. Canada's pushback demonstrated that even America's closest neighbor won't always bend, and that leaves Trump in a dangerous position. Because now, instead of looking like a strong leader securing a big win, he looks like a president who demanded the world and came back empty-handed. Number 2. Canada's pushback. Canada's refusal. To back Trump's submarine deal was more than a budgetary decision. It was a bold assertion of sovereignty. For decades, Canada has walked a careful line in its relationship with the United States. On one hand, it is deeply intertwined with U.S. defense through NORAD, NATO, and shared borders. On the other hand, Canadians have long feared being overshadowed or controlled by American military ambitions. This submarine standoff brought those tensions into sharp focus. Ottawa's message was clear. Canada is not a junior partner whose job is to rubber stamp U.S. policies. Prime Minister and defense officials explained that the deal wasn't in Canada's best interest, not only because of the massive $20 billion price tag, but because it lacked transparency and seemed rushed for political reasons. Canada wasn't convinced that buying into Trump's plan would actually strengthen its national defense. Instead, leaders argued that it risked draining resources away from other priorities, like Arctic security, climate resilience, and investments in modernizing its own forces. To Canadians, submarines are not just machines patrolling the seas. They represent strategic choices about how to defend sovereignty. Canada has always been sensitive about control over its Arctic waters, where melting ice is opening new shipping lanes and sparking interest from Russia and China. Ottawa wants to make sure its defense spending reflects uniquely Canadian concerns, not just American demands. By saying no, Canada asserted its independence and signaled that it will not be pressured into funding projects that primarily serve Washington's global ambitions. There's also a domestic angle. Canadian taxpayers are wary of ballooning defense costs, especially when healthcare, housing, and climate adaptation are top priorities at home. For politicians in Ottawa, blindly agreeing to Trump's massive submarine plan would have looked like surrendering Canadian autonomy for American politics. And that's a dangerous perception in a country where national pride is built on being close to, but not swallowed by, the United States. This pushback also reveals growing frustration with Trump's approach to alliances. During his presidency, Trump repeatedly accused NATO members, including Canada, of not spending enough on defense. While the criticism wasn't new, his blunt, confrontational style rubbed many allies the wrong way. Saying no to the submarine deal allowed Canada to draw a line in the sand, showing that it will not simply bow to U.S. pressure. In short, Canada's rejection was both practical and symbolic. It was about money, strategy, and public opinion, but it was also about dignity. By pushing back, Canada reminded the world that even the closest ally of the United States has limits, and that sovereignty sometimes means saying no, even when Washington demands yes. Number 3. NATO's ripple effect. When Canada slammed the door on Trump's submarine deal, the shockwaves didn't stop at the U.S.-Canada border. They traveled straight into NATO headquarters in Brussels. For years, NATO has faced an ongoing debate over burden sharing, with Washington often frustrated that European allies aren't spending enough on defense. Trump, both during his presidency and after, made this a central talking point. He scolded NATO members, accused them of freeloading, and threatened to cut U.S. support unless allies increased their military budgets. This submarine deal was, in many ways, a continuation of that mindset. Trump wanted Canada to prove its loyalty by buying in, but Canada's refusal flipped the script. It showed that allies can say no, even when pressured by the U.S. This act of defiance matters because NATO is built on the idea of unity. When one member resists Washington, it can embolden others. Think about countries like Germany, France, or Italy, which have long been cautious about U.S. demands for higher military spending. If Canada, the country most tightly bound to the U.S. through NORAD and shared defense, can resist, then others might feel freer to question American leadership as well. The timing couldn't be worse for NATO. The alliance is already stretched thin by Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. European nations are balancing the need to arm Kyiv with domestic political and economic pressures. Add China's growing influence into the mix, and NATO members are facing some of the toughest strategic decisions in decades. When Trump pushes a massive submarine expansion and an ally says no, it signals that Washington can't simply command obedience. This ripple effect is about more than just budgets. It's about credibility. NATO's strength has always relied on the perception that its members are united and that the U.S. leads from the front. If allies start openly rejecting U.S. defense plans, adversaries like Russia will interpret that as weakness. Moscow thrives on division, and cracks within NATO give the Kremlin hope that the alliance's unity could fracture over time. At the same time, Canada's decision may also spark overdue conversations within NATO about balance and priorities. Should the alliance focus on submarines and global deterrence, or should it prioritize regional challenges like protecting the Arctic and Eastern Europe? Canada's pushback forces NATO to confront these questions. In short, the ripple effect is twofold. It risks weakening NATO's unity by showing that allies are not always on board, but it also highlights the need for honest debates about what the alliance should actually prioritize in the 21st century. Number 4. Economic. And industrial stakes behind every defense contract, there's a story not just about strategy, but about economics. Trump's $20 billion submarine push was no exception. Military spending doesn't just create weapons. It creates jobs, fuels industries, and shapes economies. Shipyards, steel manufacturers, tech companies, and even universities, tied to research, all stand to gain from massive contracts like this one. That's why Trump's demand wasn't only about national security. It was also about funneling billions into American defense contractors, and by extension, the U.S. economy. Had Canada signed on, it would have meant billions flowing into joint projects, U.S. shipyards buzzing with work, and Canadian defense companies tied into supply chains. But Ottawa's refusal cuts off that economic boost. For American contractors like General Dynamics and Huntington Ingalls, which dominate submarine construction, the rejection represents lost opportunities. These firms lobby aggressively in Washington, and losing a $20 billion extension means uncertainty not only for workers, but also for regional economies built around defense production. From Canada's perspective, the economics looked very different. $20 billion is a staggering sum for a country with a much smaller military budget. Ottawa faces growing demands to invest in housing, healthcare, infrastructure, and climate adaptation. Committing such a huge amount to submarines, especially under Trump's terms, risked political backlash at home. Canadian leaders calculated that pouring money into American-led defense projects would not only anger taxpayers, but also limit their ability to fund industries that serve Canadian priorities, like Arctic security technology or renewable energy. This dispute highlights a bigger dilemma. Defense contracts often blur the line between strategy and economics. Governments justify spending billions on security, but behind the scenes, political leaders know that jobs and industries are just as important in selling the deal. That's why Trump leaned so heavily into this push. He wanted to show voters that he was both strengthening America's military and fueling its economy. By saying no, Canada disrupted that narrative. There's also a long-term risk. If allies stop participating in large U.S. defense projects, Washington may struggle to spread costs and keep industries thriving. Defense is expensive, and cooperation helps sustain the ecosystem. Canada's refusal could signal a trend of allies prioritizing their own economies instead of tying themselves to American defense industries. Ultimately, the economic and industrial stakes are just as important as the military ones. Trump wanted a win that created both submarines and jobs. Canada wanted to protect its budget and its sovereignty. The clash exposed how economic interests and security goals often collide in the murky world of defense deals. Number 5. The global signal, perhaps. The most dangerous consequence of this standoff isn't the submarines themselves, but the message it sends to the world. When America's closest ally, Canada, openly refuses a U.S. defense push, rivals like China and Russia see more than just a disagreement. They see weakness. Global politics is built on perception. If adversaries sense cracks in America's alliances, they exploit them. For China, this could not have come at a better time. Beijing is rapidly expanding its naval capabilities, especially in submarines and surface fleets. It wants to challenge U.S. dominance in the Pacific and project power along vital trade routes. The image of the U.S. struggling to secure support from its closest ally feeds into China's narrative that American leadership is declining. Chinese state media will almost certainly frame Canada's refusal as proof that Washington's influence is fading and that the U.S. can no longer rally the world behind its defense strategies. Russia, too, benefits from this rift. With the war in Ukraine still raging, Moscow is watching NATO closely for signs of division. Canada's defiance gives Russia propaganda material to argue that Western unity is fragile. If one of America's strongest partners won't commit to a submarine deal, Moscow can suggest that others might also hesitate when the stakes are even higher. Beyond rivals, neutral countries are also watching. Nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America often weigh whether aligning with the U.S. is worth the costs. Seeing Canada reject Trump's push may make them wonder, if even America's closest neighbor doesn't fully buy in, why should they? This could make it harder for Washington to build coalitions in future conflicts or trade disputes. There's also the reputational risk for Trump personally. His brand is built on being a deal-maker, someone who gets results. But on the global stage, failing to bring Canada along makes him look weaker, not stronger. Leaders in other countries may decide they can resist Trump's pressure too, calculating that the political costs for him are higher than for them. The global signal is therefore clear. America's dominance is not guaranteed, and its ability to lead alliances can be challenged. Every time an ally says no, it chips away at the perception of U.S. authority. And in geopolitics, perception often matters as much as reality. This is why the submarine dispute isn't just a local spat. It's a global event with ripple effects that stretch from Washington to Beijing, from Moscow to Brussels. Allies, rivals, and neutrals alike are adjusting their calculations, and none of that works in America's favor.